Hello and welcome to today's Verified Live. The Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah has given his first public response to 2 days of attacks in Lebanon using sabotage communication devices. He described the attacks as an unprecedented blow to the Iran-backed militant group, but vowed to continue to fight Israel. The number of people killed by exploding pagers and walkie-talkies has risen to 37, with over 3,000 people wounded. The Hezbollah leader said the operation crossed all red lines.
Thousands of pages were targeted by the Israeli enemy and detonated at the same time. With this operation, the enemy crossed all rules, laws and red lines. It didn't care about anything at all, not morally, not humanely, not legally.
Let's go live to Beirut, live to our correspondent Hugo Bachega. Hugo, you listened to the entirety of that. Give me your analysis.
Yeah, I think it was very interesting that he acknowledged that this was a massive security blow, unprecedented in the history of Hezbollah. As expected, he promised a harsh punishment, but he didn't give any indication of how this response is going to be. But I think it was also interesting that there was no change in Hezbollah's position. Again, the indication is that Hezbollah is not interested in an escalation in this conflict with Israel. We've seen that for almost a year, Hezbollah has been attacking positions in northern Israel, saying that this is in solidarity with Palestinians in Gaza. Hassan Nasrallah again said that this campaign, these attacks are going to continue unless there is a ceasefire in Gaza. So this has been the main hope here, to de-escalate these tensions between Israel and Hezbollah, and those negotiations for a ceasefire in Gaza have been unable to reach a deal. Hassan Nasrallah also reflected on those decisions that have been taken by the Israeli authorities to add the return of those residents who've been displaced from communities in northern Israel as one of the war goals. He said that these attempts by Israel will not succeed, and again that these attacks by Hezbollah are going to continue. So no clear indication of what Hezbollah is going to do. Again, as expected, some harsh words against Israel, saying that these attacks that happened here in Lebanon amounted to a declaration of war. He said it was a massacre, and again reflecting on the suffering of the population here over the last 2 days.
Hugo, as you were talking there, we were showing pictures of those Israeli jets that screamed really low over Beirut earlier at the start of that speech. You've been there in the city over the last couple of days. I was talking to someone from Beirut only in the last hour who was saying how different the last 48 hours have felt there. What has it been like?
Exactly, and it has been different because we've seen that this conflict has been by and large contained to areas along the border between Lebanon and Israel. And now what's happened in the last 2 days is that this conflict has been felt by the population here of Beirut and other parts of Lebanon. And obviously people here are scared. They're very angry as well because of the extent of these attacks. These are explosions that happened as people were shopping, were with their families at home. Children are among the dead. But again, these are explosions that happened across the country and including in several parts here of Beirut, creating panic in the population. One of our producers received a message from a friend saying that she was replacing her Lebanese SIM card with an international one because he was concerned that her phone could explode. So I think this gives you a sense of the feeling here of how scared the population is after those 2 days of attacks.
Hugo, live for us there in Beirut. Thanks very much. Let's continue with this with our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucet, who's here with me. Lise, it was fascinating listening to the different stages of Hassan Nasrallah talking there. How weakened is Hezbollah, do you think?
Well, of course, he put on a very brave face today, saying that their communications network had not been shattered. But from everything that we have seen and just the numbers alone, right across the country, also in pagers and walkie-talkies are exploding, also in Syria and in Iran, it is clear that they're communications network has been crippled, their confidence has been struck, and also you heard from Hassan Nasrallah that this was the most devastating, most humiliating blow, unprecedented for them. So yes, they are in many, many ways, they are weakened by it. And the question will be, they will now feel honor bound. And this is what we're hearing from Hassan Nasrallah. He talked about a reckoning. They have to show that they are able and willing to strike back. And some of our colleagues who follow his statements really, really closely are saying that what's different in this speech this time, we've had many defiant speeches from Hassan Nasrallah since the events of October the 7th and throughout this rising tension along that Lebanese-Israeli border, that he always says when they're struck in the aftermath, we reserve the right to respond at an appropriate time and place. This time, he warned Israelis, you will not just hear the response, you will see it this time.
Well, that's interesting, and interesting that you pick out those words. What do you make of Israel's strategy, the sorts of decisions that have been made over the last 3 days, adding a new war aim, we saw that Sunday night, then talking about a new phase of the war, then moving troops to the north of Israel?
Yes, there's been a steady drumbeat, isn't there? The eve of this, what has to be called a mass casualty attack, even though Israel says it has pinpointed, as you've been reporting, we've been reporting ever since they happened, it was very indiscriminate. They went off in markets and fathers' hands when their children were close by. Well, just before that, Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Security Cabinet added to their war aims the return of 60,000 Israelis from the communities along the Lebanon border, returning to their homes. They have been living as displaced people ever since these tensions started rising in October. Then we had the pager count. Whether that was coincidence or not, there's a growing view, Matthew, and I'm sure you've reflected it on the program, that it was a kind of a use it or lose it moment, that some Hezbollah operatives understood that something was wrong with the system. Israel had to use this weapon, in other words, or else they would lose this kind of tool. And yet again today, even with the buzzing of the aircraft lower than ever before, there's this constant message from Israel: we know where you are and we can get you, even in your hands.
And only in the last 10-15 minutes, we've seen Antony Blinken. This time he's in Paris. He's been shuffling around both the region and other Western capitals, again asking, pleading for a de-escalation. But every step is the opposite of that. Where is diplomacy, do you think, within all of what we're seeing?
Well, Amos Hochstein, who is the envoy for President Biden to work on the Lebanon front, what has been called since the beginning the second front, he was in Tel Aviv when these tensions were ratcheted up, when they added this new Lebanon war aim to their list already, the Gaza list, including, of course, bringing the hostages home. Hassan Nasrallah today made it clear that the border would not be safe and calm, that the residents would not return home in the north of Israel until there was a ceasefire in Gaza. That is the view of Hezbollah. That's the view of Iran. The only way to end this violence is to end the Gaza war. And yes, Antony Blinken is continuing to shuttle, he went to Cairo to talk to the Egyptians, who played a leading role. And there's a new proposal on the table. It doesn't seem as though it's one that can be acceptable to Sinwar, from everything we know about this most militant, the most even Hamas people describe him as the most violent in a violent organization, that he would not want to leave the Gaza Strip. But that offer is now being put on the table, it seems, from the reports that we've seen, that in exchange for releasing all of the hostages, that there would be so-called safe passage for Sinwar and other Hamas leaders to leave Gaza. But there are many who are saying that's just not the ilk of Sinwar. They're not going to leave.
I was talking about Antony Blinken and the message around Lebanon and de-escalation. It's worth just playing that clip in the next few seconds.
France and the United States are united in calling for restraint and urging de-escalation when it comes to the Middle East in general and when it comes to Lebanon in particular. We continue to work to get a ceasefire for Gaza over the finish line. And as we discussed with some of you just a day ago in Egypt, we believe that remains both possible and necessary. But meanwhile, we don't want to see any escalatory actions by any party that make that even more difficult.
Well, it is an extremely difficult situation at the moment for diplomacy. A final word, Lise, because you have the Iranians also watching. They claim they
and
have
vowing retaliation.
Yes, they have unfinished business, according to them. How dangerous, then, is this moment that we've arrived at?
This is the most dangerous moment we've seen for decades in the Middle East, and a region that is all too often plunged into this kind of a violence. There have been many, sadly, for people of the region, many wars, but there has never been this kind of a war which draws in so many players at the same time, and so many players willing to use whatever it takes to get what they want to take.
Least to say.